All right, in this movie, we'll look at the revolve form. A revolve rotates a sketch shape around an axis line. The result is pretty similar to the effect of turning a form on a lathe, and we did an example of that in the previous chapter. So we're going to take a little more detailed look at it right now. So as with the previous movie, I simply have an empty family file on screen here. This was created with generic model, but you could follow along in really any template. All the forms work the same in any template file. The first thing that we want to do is decide what's the most logical view to build this thing in. Now, if I worked in plan view, then I'm going to be spinning around an axis that's going to be within the plan plane. Probably easier to just illustrate than to explain. So click on the revolve form, and you see that there are two buttons here, boundary line and axis line. And if you did the previous chapter, then you've already seen an example of this. We have all the same sketch tools that we had for extrusion, so these are pretty common tools. For this one, I'm going to do a simple rectangle, and I'm going to draw it just in plan over here. Then I'm going to switch over to my axis line, and you can either draw it or pick it. I'm going to draw it over here somewhere. Now, when I deselect this, what you're seeing is the axis is here, the sketch is over here. So in order to spin this shape around this axis, it's essentially going to orbit around that line, and you're going to get a donut shape or a ring when we're done. When I click Finish, because we're working in plan and it's spun around this axis, it's actually spinning up towards and away from me. And when you look at it here in 3D, you see that I sort of have this ring shape that's been created vertically. Elevation is probably the easiest way to see this in the front elevation. So the shape that we drew was here, and it spun all the way around the axis that was right there. Now, if you edit the form, you can edit either the shape or the axis line. So I could come in and change the shape, but I've got to make sure it's enclosed. If I tried to finish right now, I'm going to get an error. Just like we saw with extrusions, the revolves have to be closed shapes. So I'll make sure that I snap that over here, and I click Finish. And we still end up with a donut shape here, but now it's got a little taper to it, as you can see. It's following that new form that I created. Let's edit it again. What would happen if I took the axis line and moved it a little closer? Well, now I get a much tighter circle. Naturally, if I edit it again and move it further away, I get a much bigger ring. And perhaps I change the angle, and you'll get a ring at another angle. So you can see, without changing work plane at all or really doing anything to the overall form itself, just by changing the axis line sketch or the sketch of the shape itself, there's a wide variety of possibilities. So part of the challenge when breaking down the form you're creating is to break it down into these simpler forms, like to look at the object that you're trying to build in the family editor and think about which forms it should be constructed from and break it down into those smaller parts. So maybe you can use an extrude for a little piece over here and a revolve for some other piece over there, and then when you bring them together, you get the completed form. In the extrude, we looked at the properties palette, and we saw that there were some properties. We saw there was work plane, as we have here, and I'm again using the reference level work plane. But now, instead of a start and an end extrusion, I have a start angle and an end angle. So I can do some interesting things right here. What would happen if I change the end angle to 180 degrees? Well, now instead of getting a full circle, I get a half ring. I can put it in any angle I like and get smaller and smaller chunks. I can even put in negative and make it go the other way. The concept of work plane and the direction of the work plane that was discussed in the first movie in this chapter applies here as well. The direction that the angle is going to be measured from is going to be in that positive direction of the work plane. If you want to reverse that, you can use a negative angle. But you can do both a start angle and an end angle. If I change the start angle here to 20 and the end angle to negative 45, you see what starts to happen. It starts down here, and then it goes past and ends up over here. So the work plane is in the middle somewhere, but by changing the two angles, you can influence the way the overall form gets created. And then in a similar fashion to what we saw in extrusions, these forms can also use multiple shapes. Same rules apply as long as the shapes don't intersect one another. And now I've carved a hole in the middle of my form there. So that's our revolve form. A lot of similarities to the extrusion, but it rotates along an axis rather than extruding along a straight path.